Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've talked for a few lessons about Keynesianism, macro activism, fiscal policy, stabilization techniques, and it seems almost, perhaps, that Keynesianism is the way to go, that government intervention in the economy is something that needs to happen on a regular basis, that's very predictable and reliable and useful. I want to go back to the other side of the aisle and spend some time, thanks to classical theorists, talking about some weaknesses of fiscal policy. Certainly after World War II, for the next few decades, Keynesianism was on the rise. It was a very popular mode of approaching government's relationship with the economy, and there was a lot of consensus in a lot of parts of the world that this is the way that things just needed to be from then on out. But it wasn't consistently like that to present day. So there's a couple of weaknesses we want to point out here that come from the classical theorist camp. One is the permanent income hypothesis, which says that consumer spending ultimately depends mainly on the income people expect to have over the long term rather than on their current income. You could possibly visualize this for yourself. If you feel like you're going to have a significant increase in your income, maybe you're going to have a relatively large payday several months from now, a year or two from now, you might spend beyond your means today. And that would be a relatively normal human inclination. Might not be wise, but you'd say, well, I've got money coming in, and though it looks like on paper today money is tight, I'm about to have a pretty big payday. So the permanent income hypothesis recognizes this, and classical theorists say that you might, as a matter of fiscal policy, try to increase the disposable income that people have, their current income today, and sure, there could be a multiplier effect, but that's not necessarily going to translate perfectly the way that you might expect. Classical theorists also put forth the life cycle hypothesis, which says that people try to smooth their consumption over their lifetimes. They save some of their current disposable income during their years of peak earnings when they're in their 40s and 50s for later consumption when they're typically much older and they're retired, and so they almost take a mean or an average through the middle of those peak years of earning. And so if, once again, through fiscal policy and activism, you try to increase people's current incomes, they're not necessarily always going to spend as much as you think they are. Another really important concept that has to do with the weaknesses of fiscal policy is crowding out. So there's a visual that I put here for you, and there's a couple of different facets to crowding out. First of all, how much crowding out takes place. What's crowding out? Crowding out is essentially government spending that replaces consumption and investment, or in other words, spending that households and companies would do on their own, but now the government's doing for them. This, of course, would seem kind of counterproductive to fiscal intervention in the economy. If the government says, oh my gosh, we happen to be in a recession, and let's say, according to this visual, that's point one. We need to, get more of the stuff that we want out of our economy. We want to get closer to long-run equilibrium, which of course means closer to our natural level of output, our natural income level, our natural unemployment level, and all of those good things. We're going to increase spending, and yes, thank you, Keynes, for pointing this out. There's going to be a spending multiplier effect, so we're going to increase spending by $100 billion. It's not necessarily going to play out the way that you expect, because if you do it unwisely, if you target your spending in areas where people say, you know what, thanks a lot, government, for buying this thing or these services for me that I would have already planned on buying, perhaps through autonomous consumption, that piece of the consumption function, or in the area of investment, thank you, government, for providing factories additional equipment or other facets of investment, then it's not going to have the impact that you would expect it to have. So How much crowding out is shown here, if you have crowding out at all. If the government, for instance, says we're going to increase spending by $100 billion, and consumers and companies in connection with this increase in spending decrease their spending by the same amount, then we have complete crowding out. It has completely negated the private spending that would take place, and the AD curve doesn't shift to the right at all. We're just stuck where we are. That, of course, would be a huge waste of resources. If the federal government spends $100 billion, but consumption and investment go down $100 billion. Think about it in terms of, once again, the expenditures approach, C plus I plus G plus NX. We would say in this example that the G increases $100 billion, but C plus I combined decrease by $100 billion. That's complete crowding out. Now maybe it's not that negative. Maybe the government increases spending and it has some effect, but it doesn't get us all the way to long-run equilibrium, and AD moves to the right somewhat, but we still are in a recessionary gap. That would be an example of incomplete crowding out. Or in other words, there's some crowding out. Incomplete crowding out. If, of course, the fiscal intervention is positive and it completely hits the mark and we get all the way back to long-run equilibrium, then that's good news, and that's what we know to be zero or no crowding out. And that's what this point is an example of. So this entire visual has to do with how much, if any, crowding out, and how we show that. Right? If we don't have any, then we get to long-run equilibrium. If we have complete crowding out, all right, then we don't move at all, or we could be somewhere in between. But these terms down below, direct crowding out and indirect crowding out, refer to something a little bit different. It's not how much crowding out might be taking place, but how does it take place in the first instance. It's not a measurement, but a description of the cause and effect. So direct crowding out is the simplest. Okay, if we have complete or incomplete crowding out, then if it's direct in nature, we're saying the government spending replaces consumption and investment, the way that I just described. But it might happen in a little more circuitous fashion. It might be more indirect in nature. And what indirect crowding out says is that, well, the government doesn't spend, let's say $100 billion on shoes and computer equipment for businesses, and so consumers and businesses say, thank you very much, I'm not going to spend that money that I was going to spend anyway. It is more indirect. It takes more steps, and it's a different dynamic when you have indirect crowding out. What happens is government borrowing, as we've talked about before, very significant in the case of the United States and a lot of other places around the world, frankly. Government borrowing takes place in order to increase their spending, because they're spending beyond their means, perhaps, in order to stabilize an economy. When they do that, that increases interest rates, which decrease consumption and investment. So indirect crowding out still leads to a decrease in consumption and investment, but not because the government's buying things for households and for firms that they were going to buy for themselves, but because they're raising interest rates. And not too long ago, I showed you an example of this, but I can do this again. If you have the loanable funds market, for instance, and we have the real interest rate on this axis, and we have the quantity of loanable funds on this axis, this is the supply of loanable funds, and this is the demand for loanable funds. We have little r to symbolize real interest rate, and Q sub 1 is where we are currently with the quantity of loanable funds. And the government comes into this market and says, we want to stimulate the economy, but we don't have the extra money sitting there. And frankly, this is not a true Keynesian position. Keynes would say that we should run up government surpluses in good times and then call on those surpluses to increase spending when we need to in difficult times. He was not a major proponent on a regular basis, the way that we have acted in the last several decades in the United States, of deficit spending year after year after year and borrowing to finance this spending. But if the government comes into this loanable funds market and says we need to borrow, and as you know, federal government doesn't just go to banks, they issue bonds typically to get this done, then that's going to shift the demand for loanable funds to the right, ceteris paribus, which leads to a new equilibrium point, and most significantly, a higher real interest rate. So what they do is they make it more expensive for people like you and me that have to take long-term loans in particular. Remember, the loanable funds market has terms or maturity date, which says, how far into the future do you have to repay this loan, of more than 1 year. What kind of loans are that? Well, these are, big loans, expensive loans, loans for major purchases, like homes, like cars, like college education. And so if the federal government increases interest rates for all of us that would be in this market to take longer term loans, then some of us aren't going to be able to afford them. Once upon a time, I was looking at buying a home closer to Chaminade. Right now I live in Porter Ranch. I have for several years. But my family was looking at the possibility of getting a home in West Hills to save time for convenience. West Hills is a beautiful place. No knock on Porter Ranch, it's beautiful too. But if you're somebody like me that's on a teacher's salary, interest rates make a big difference. And if you're in my position and interest rates start to rise, it's possible that they rise so far that now you can't afford to take a loan to buy this big purchase. Most of us don't pay for cars and homes and things of this nature in cash. We have to put a down payment down if we've got it. Most of the time we have, a fraction of what it's going to cost full price to buy these major purchases, and the rest of it we have to finance with a long-term loan. So the interest rate is a really key piece, and what we're saying is that indirect crowding out is where the government increases interest rates, and when they do, then they make it too expensive for some people to buy what they were going to buy. And that leads to complete crowding out or incomplete crowding out. So when it comes to crowding out, you could have direct complete crowding out, you could have direct incomplete crowding out, indirect complete, or indirect incomplete crowding out. So understand all four combinations of those terms. But another weakness potentially to fiscal policy. There are also lags with fiscal policy, particularly in the discretionary area of fiscal policy, when politicians say, well, we're going to wait and see what happens with the economy, observe, and then if we need to, we'll take action. Well, this takes time. And as you see here, there are 5 different types of lags: the data lag, the wait and see lag, the legislative lag, the transmission lag, and the effectiveness lag. When you add up all of these lags when it comes to policymakers using their discretion to decide whether or not to change taxes and spending, you could have several months from the beginning with the data lag to the very end and the effectiveness lag before you realize whether or not your action was effective, and perhaps you even overshoot your mark. You're in some kind of a recessionary gap, and thanks to classical theorists, we know if wages and prices are flexible, the economy will start to fix itself at some point. SORAS will shift, and you as a policymaker, along with other people in Congress and the president perhaps, decide to take some action. By the time you get all the consensus together and there seems to be enough data, and you say, okay, we're going to pass this legislation, and then we put it into effect, by then the economy could have fixed itself, and you might be overshooting the mark thanks to your action and putting the economy in an inflationary gap. So lags are another criticism, potential weakness of fiscal policy. There's also something known as supply-side fiscal policy. Most of what we've talked about to this point has to do with shifting the AD curve back and forth. One of the major advances of Keynesianism was a focus on the AD curve. Up until that point, as you know, classical theorists focused primarily on the short-run aggregate supply. He changed the game in that way and said, no, we also really look very closely at aggregate demand, and that's where a lot of the policy prescriptions from Keynesians have focused, is on shifting aggregate demand. But we shouldn't completely forget or leave out supply-side fiscal policy in that whole theory, because this is something that, particularly under the Reagan administration, really took hold. But typically fiscal policy is focused on aggregate demand because consumption and investment are really large parts of the economy, big numbers. And if you'll recall, there are several actions that the government can also take to affect SORAS, and that's what we want to address here. They can change payroll taxes to influence how many people business owners want to hire, which can ultimately increase or decrease supply. They can change corporate income taxes. They can change the amounts or recipients, who gets grants and subsidies, in addition to how much they want to put out there. And in particular, according to Arthur Laffer, there's an interesting story that he got this inspiration when he was in a restaurant or a cafe, I believe, and he sketched out his curve on a napkin. That the government can also establish lower marginal, remember marginal means extra or additional, lower marginal tax rates to increase the incentives for workers to put more time in at work, as opposed to leisure time or tax avoidance activities, ceteris paribus. And as resources shift from leisure to work, SORAS shifts. It increases. And in theory, the government could increase tax revenues by cutting tax rates, because also the percentage will increase and the tax base could increase. So this is an example of a Laffer curve, and what you'll notice is that there's not much in the way of numbers along the bottom axis where the tax rate is found. Basically, what Laffer was saying is, you could have 0% income tax all the way up to 100% income tax, and if you happen to have current income tax rates that are so high that they are a disincentive to work, because people say, well, gosh, what's the point of working, because the government's going to take almost all of it anyway, then you could cut taxes and still increase tax revenues. The rationale is that individuals will work more, invest more, enter into more trades, and so that'll stimulate economic activity, and other kinds of taxes will ramp up as a result of these trades, and people will shelter less income from taxes at lower tax rates. And so this concept was a major piece of President Reagan's economic policy. This is really what he's referring to in many ways, in addition to deregulation legislation, when he was campaigning and then after he was in office, and he was saying, we need to get government off our backs. We need to get them off our backs. Now, the CBO estimates from that time period show no sign of acceleration of growth after the Reagan tax cuts. So there's a lot of macroeconomists that feel like supply-side economics is something that's been discredited, but there are some people, conservative of nature, that feel like this is a really important piece that should not be overlooked.